So folks have been dropping in the chat where they're calling in from. And we're calling in, as you can see, from many different lands tonight. If you know the original people of the land you're currently on, feel free to drop their name in the chat and honor them. I am zooming in from Tacoma, Washington tonight, and I acknowledge that I'm on the traditional homelands of the Puyallup and Nisqually tribes, as well as on lands with deep significance to other Coast Salish tribes. Coast Salish people have lived on and stewarded these lands since time immemorial and continue to do so today. And I extend my deepest gratitude to past, present, and future generations. Tonight, I'm so excited because we have been rejoined by our theologian and residence, Bible scholar and movement builder, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. And I am thrilled to be joined by our guest speaker, our LGBTQ plus youth organizer and chaplain, Moses Hernandez. Moses is joining us from Atlanta. He's part of Church of the Common Ground there and also Freedom Church of the Poor. And we're going to hear from him in just a little bit. But before we go any further, let's do what we usually do. We're going to pray. We're going to go over our covenant for respect and safety, and then we're going to start with Bible study. God, through your Son, Jesus, you came into this world as a child, born into poverty, and despite the harsh and exploited lives of most children who lived when your Son walked the earth, he said, "Let the children come to me," and taught us that in the kingdom of heaven, children come first. So God, tonight we pray especially for your children and your youth, that we see and honor them as you command us to do, in their wisdom, in their self-knowing. And we pray for the safety and thriving, especially of all your children and young people in harm's way right now, God. In danger because of policy violence, in danger because of abuse, in spiritual danger because they have been falsely told that you do not love them because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. And God, tonight, on the night of October 7th, we pray for the over 41,000 Palestinians, the majority of them women and children, and 1,200 Israelis killed in war. Make us instruments of your peace and justice in this world. In the name of the one who creates, redeems, and sanctifies all of us, no exceptions. Amen. So who's in the room with us tonight? Looks like a bunch of you. I'm happy to see you. As I said earlier, we got an awesome spread of people who are joining us for this series. Registration has come in from 33 states across the US and 9 different countries, including Zimbabwe, South Africa, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Colombia, Albania, and Canada. And we are providing live simultaneous translation in both Spanish and American Sign Language. Thank you so much. Round of applause for our interpretation team. Quick check-in about security and housekeeping. Just some reminders. We have a zero tolerance policy for bullying, for harassment, threats, and hate speech in this series. Anybody who undertakes any of these will be immediately removed from the Zoom room by our tech team and will not be able to rejoin future sessions. Another reminder, we are not debating in this class on the personhood, the sanctity, or the spiritual leadership of LGBTQ plus people and women. And we are not debating whether all people deserve safe and legal access to reproductive health care. We are also not debating whether people deserve to live free from violence in all forms. So if you have questions about any of those stances, you can refer to the General Convention of the Episcopal Church and its stances on these issues. Another safety reminder, this is a public series, So we are recording each of these sessions, which we will then post on the Episcopal Church's website afterwards for anyone who wants to catch up. So just keep that in mind when you're doing Q&A. Um, don't don't out anybody who's not already out. Like if your mom just came out to you and you go to church together, you can say, I'm Mavis from St. Mary's Church in Mobile, Alabama, and my mom, who also goes to that church, just came out to me. Don't do that. You can say, I'm Mavis, I'm from St. Mary's in Mobile, Alabama, and there is this person I love who just came out to me, and I want to know how to support them. Along those lines, again, this is a public series, so be mindful of the information you choose to disclose about yourself. We honor people's choices to share their testimonies publicly, and we also recognize the fact that it's not always safe to do so. So the last thing we want to do is to have you put yourself at risk unnecessarily. Lastly, if you have any tech issues, please just chat us. We'll be watching and responding to tech and accessibility issues in the chat. And I think that's it for housekeeping. So let's do what we usually do. We'll read the Bible together. We'll do this same passage that we're going to do at the beginning of class. Then we'll have our guest presentation. And then we'll do the same passage at the end of the class, see what hits different or more deeply. So thank you, Melanie. I see you putting the slides up. And I wonder if we could get a volunteer, hit your hand raise button, somebody to read this text in English, and then somebody else to read it in Spanish. And if you raise your hand, Melanie can unmute you. We're reading from Matthew 19, verses 11 through 15 tonight. Who would like to read?
I could read.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay. Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." Then people brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." When he had placed his hands on them, he went on from there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Do we have a Spanish reader? Would anybody like to read in Spanish? Just hit your raise hand button. I see Giselle.
Buenas noches, sí.
It's all you. Go for it. Thank you.
Jesús les dijo, no todos pueden aceptar este precepto, sino solo aquellos a quienes se les ha sido dado, porque hay eunucos que así nacieron desde el seno de su madre, y hay eunucos que fueron hechos eunucos por los hombres, y también hay eunucos que asimismo se hicieron eunucos por causa del reino de los cielos. El que pueda aceptar esto, que lo acepte. Entonces le trajeron algunos niños para que pusiera las manos sobre ellos y orara. Y los discípulos los reprendieron, pero Jesús dijo, dejad a los niños y no les impidáis que vengan a mí, porque de los que son como estos es el reino de los cielos. Y después de poner las manos sobre ellos, se fue de allí.
Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. So I think Reverend Liz is leading us in Bible study tonight. I hope she is, because I'm not.
Well, it's good to be with you, Aaron, and with everybody. So good to see folk and see folks' names. And I was sad that I did not get a chance to be with people last week, but excited to be back this week. So I want to say like 4 overall points. I'm going to keep it brief, but I do want to talk a little bit about this text. Then I'm excited for us to engage it together and then return to it, as Aaron said, at the end of the conversation. So my bullet points, if I were to have bullet points in front of you, are 1, about how we space and divide this text. 2, what the message of the text around marriage is. 3, what the message of the text around eunuchs and gender nonconforming people is. And 4, what it could mean, whoever can accept this. So 1, I think it's really important that you might have noticed when we read this text this evening, and perhaps we actually should put the text up just again so people can have it in front of you and be thinking about it. Thank you, Reverend Melanie. That often the first couple of phrases of this text are read in conversation with the first verses of Matthew 19, but that this evening we're reading this text in conversation with the verses that follow. So you might remember that Matthew 19 starts off with often what people talk about is Jesus's message on divorce. And then this conversation about eunuchs happens at the end, or the kind of conclusion of that, especially as Jesus's followers are starting to feel overwhelmed by the question of marriage and divorce, and are talking about, well, maybe this moves us to a place where there's kind of this non-binary gender expression. And then, in most Bibles, there's this very convenient little pause and a new heading that says, Jesus welcomes the children. And so we think that the story about marriage, about divorce, about eunuchs, about gender nonconforming people is done, and we've moved on to talk about a light, fluffy, like cuddly topic of Jesus loving kids. And I think what we're trying to suggest this evening is that heading didn't exist back in the Greek papyrus, that the conversation about eunuchs has just as much to do with Jesus welcoming the children, and all children, male children, female children, gender nonconforming children, as it does with the rest of the passage about marriage and divorce. So that's the first point. What if we actually read this text the way that it was originally written, which doesn't have cute little footnotes or little headings, but actually the writers of Matthew's gospel put this story about let the children come to me and do not hinder them right after Jesus explicitly talks about gender nonconforming people. That's point 1. Point 2, let's talk a little bit about marriage and divorce, because so often the first part of Matthew 19 is used to try to reify, to establish very strict barriers, very strict kind of lines, divisions, a binary look at gender and of marriage and of divorce. And there's these references to Genesis 1, and there's these references to Genesis 2. And then there's this conversation that Jesus has about eunuchs. And what I think is important for us to to look at is the question of marriage and divorce and gender in the ancient world. Now, I know that the last 2 weeks, some attention has been paid to gender nonconformity in our biblical texts, the 6 to 8 different genders that happen throughout the Hebrew scriptures, other passages where eunuchs and gender nonconforming people are showing up in the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian Testament. And I want to suggest that the conversation about marriage is not so simple and is not so apolitical or politicized in a way to be talking about, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, or, you shouldn't have marriage between 2 men or 2 women or amongst trans folk. In fact, when we look at the Genesis passages that the earlier texts in Matthew are referring, there's actually a lot more fluidity happening around gender, around marriage, around humans that have been created in God's image, God using an our and us pronouns, which I think we should hear they and them then when we refer to God in that creation story. If God is talking about us and we, then shouldn't we be actually putting gender pronouns of they and them on God? Not necessarily to mean that there's more than one God. In fact, to mean that God in the breadth of who God is shows up, in Genesis, as gender nonconforming as well, and as non-binary as well. The second point about marriage that I think is important in this passage is who is controlling marriage and who is saying who can marry whom in Jesus's time. So often in our world today, when we talk about marriage and we talk about marriage in the Bible, it's folks that self-identify as Christian who are saying who is allowed to marry who. And they put on Jesus actually what Jesus heard from the emperor and from the powers that be. So who had the power to control who was marrying whom? And we'll get into this in future sessions, was the Roman Empire. And in fact, Caesar Augustus was passing marriage laws at the time. And so I think it's important for us when we're reading a passage that talks about marriage, that talks about divorce, for us to remember that Caesar Augustus and the emperor at the time of Jesus's life on earth was actually saying men cannot marry men, women cannot marry women, the enslaved cannot marry those who are free. Folks from one nation cannot marry those from another nation. And in fact, this question of marriage and therefore of divorce is actually in the realm of imperial rulers. That's marriage. Now, let's talk for a minute about eunuchs. In this passage, it's beautiful. It's amazing, right? Here you have Jesus actually identifying and actually talking about the multiple ways that gender nonconformity is expressing itself in the world. There's multiple ways for us to understand who eunuchs in the Bible are, and this passage reminds us that there were folk that were born not fitting into society's expectations of gender conformity. There were young boys that were castrated before puberty and who don't then fit into a male gender. There are prisoners of war and very subjugated enslaved people who are gender nonconforming. And Jesus is talking about in this passage when we hear, and I'm excited for folks to also notice what you notice, that there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, right? And in Matthew, the kingdom of heaven is God's empire, is God's realm. It's where God's vision that everybody is in and nobody is out, where everyone can thrive and not just barely survive. And here you have Jesus talking in response to folks trying to get him in trouble, like they're regularly trying to do, that you can be a gender nonconforming person for the sake of everybody in and God's beautiful vision of justice. So there's more to say, and I can put more resources in the chat. But then the last point I want us to think about is both how this passage opens, and then how it transitions to let the children come to me. He says, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. Just think about how much our churches struggle with inclusion, struggle with justice. Not everyone can accept it, but Jesus still instructs us to do it. And then reminds us that the one who can accept it should. And then without missing a beat, without taking a breath, then these little children come to Jesus, and he prays for them. And he talks about, again, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. So just wanted to put a couple of those thoughts out there. Excited to have some bigger conversation for people to point out other pieces that you're noticing in this text, other ways that this is showing up. But I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you.
Oh, and Aaron put into you're going to go for it. Go for it. Thanks.
I was just going to say, thank you so much, Liz. This is awesome. And let's hear from you all. If you want to put your hand raise button up or drop in the chat what some of your thoughts are. And the questions we put out there are: what jumped out at you about this text? What part of this text feels most live for you right now? Does this make you think of anything going on in the world or your life right now? And I see we got a question from Christy. I'm still a bit confused about how eunuchs represent all gender nonconforming people. My own general understanding of eunuchs, which is very limited, are persons who would otherwise have been considered male in the modern way of thinking. Liz, do you want to say something about that, or do you want me to?
I do, and then maybe you can, or maybe you should go first, and then either way, I do have something to say.
Say it.
Yeah. So, and I should not have been saying that eunuchs represent all gender nonconforming people. And in fact, there's a lot of other gender nonconformity in our biblical texts, and in our extra canonical biblical texts. I was thinking one of these weeks we could bring a couple of non-canonical texts that probably don't make it into our Bible because they're so gender nonconforming, right? They're so radical. They're so pushing inclusivity and justice. Just to give you a sneak preview of that, like if you haven't already, for instance, read Thunder, a Perfect Mind, that's another very gender nonconforming text that's all in the voice of a female, but again, really pushing the boundaries. So I'm not trying to suggest that the eunuchs and the eunuchs being discussed in this passage are all gender nonconforming people. But the reality of eunuchs in the Bible is that, and in biblical times, is that they were not considered male. They were not considered men. They did not fit into both kind of masculinity of the time and of maleness. And so eunuchs are gender nonconforming people in their day, and we should understand them, I think, as gender nonconforming people in our day. And so Aaron, you probably have a lot more to say about that, but I do, and I can send out some resources. I'll put it in the chat right now. There's an organization I was actually talking to today earlier that does a lot of kind of theology and looking at gender and gender identity. And there's a couple of really good passages that I was looking at. I'll suggest them to folks, but Aaron, you should jump in.
Oh, I think that's really good, Liz. And I think something that I was thinking about with our reading last week too, we read from Isaiah 56. And one of the things we talked about is it's hard to know how much we have lost over 2 millennia, right? And the words that have been lost through translation, through colonialism, all that kind of stuff. But I think like with this passage that we read, right, where Jesus said there's 3 ways that people become eunuchs. Those, if you remember, there's an article we shared after the first class about the 8 genders in the Jewish Talmud. The Jesus breakdown there of like 3 ways kind of maps onto that system. And in that system, there's actually 8 different words for these different people, right? So briefly, that category, like that framework in Jewish law, is there people who, they're born male or female at birth, and they continue to identify that way for the rest of their life, right? And then there's people who are at birth, have neither of the sexual characteristics of either binary gender, who are identified as tumtum people. Then there are people who at birth display sexual characteristics of both genders, which I cannot remember any of the other names. And then there are people who, like it says in this reading, people who are made to be gender nonconforming as a result of other people's treatment of them. And then people who are born into one gender and then by the time they have developed into adulthood identify as the other gender. And so we only get in the Bible, we only get the one word eunuch, but there's lots of different words just in like the realm of the ancient Hebrew world for this, let alone all the other words that there might be in the Roman context, right? Which there are legal terms for gender nonconforming people in the Roman context. And we know this because the Roman Empire passed laws against gender nonconformity, against sexual nonconformity. We also don't know what those words are. Somebody might know. I just don't know what those words are in the Ethiopian context, right? We know that third gender people, eunuchs, exist in that context. We have a story about that, but there's so much more history there that hasn't made it into our canon. I don't know if that helps at all. I want to see, I'm looking through the chat here. People are dropping awesome things. Check out those links. Kirsten had a question. Last week, I think there was some discussion of eunuchs and their place in empire. What, if any, connection might there be between the way empire controls marriage and the status of eunuchs at the time Jesus is speaking and Matthew is writing? That's a really good question, Liz. I bet you have something to say about that.
Well, I think you were actually just kind of alluding to it right before, which is that, again, it's the empire that is controlling marriage and is controlling gender identity and expression and is controlling like just gender and gender roles. And in fact, the Jesus movement, the Basileia movement, the Kingdom of God movement is constantly pushing back and against all of that. Both, I think, I would say in multiple ways. One, I think on purpose, politically pushing back and kind of pushing the boundaries and exposing the the how this doesn't fit into what God wants. And I think part of how we can hear that is, that really famous Pauline expression from Galatians, there's neither Jew nor Greek, no, no slave nor free, and no male nor female, right? And I think we have spiritualized that so much that we assume that that's not material. And in fact, when there's a very explicit kind of political message in that, in that phrase, which is, again, not just saying everybody, we love everyone, love is, which is a really important point too, but actually kind of blowing out the ideas. So that's, I think, explicitly kind of political. But then there's also just all the ways that poor and marginalized and gender nonconforming and other kind of groups of the enslaved, in the Roman Empire have been marginalized and have to, out of survival, push against those boundaries. And so, I often think, when it comes to gender identity laws or marriage laws, you wouldn't impose them if people weren't pushing those boundaries. You wouldn't need a marriage law to say only men can marry women if there's nobody trying to challenge those laws. You wouldn't need a law that says this is the way you should express your gender if people aren't actually outside of those laws. And so, and some of that is happening, again, because people are pushing those boundaries, but a lot of it is people are compelled to push those boundaries because of their position, as marginalized and as impoverished and as enslaved by an empire that benefited greatly from a patriarchal household system that again we can talk about more.
Totally. There's well, I see Alicia's got a hand up. Let's take Alicia off mute.
Hi, everybody. I hope everyone's having a great evening. So, Liz, you've mentioned twice in both of your responses, you discussed the Roman Empire and the law and who was making the legal decisions as to who could get married. And I think that it's important for me to remember that while we can conflate things like Roman Empire and Christianity, the truth is that the Roman Empire was the government. It was the government. It was, that was the government, and they made the laws. So somewhere along the way, we came to that, and we confused that because in the Torah, the Hebrews, they have their laws. And so when we came along and we invented all of these governments that were not necessarily based on any kind of spiritual text or biblical text or any religion whatsoever, it was hard for us to separate the law from the law. And it brings to mind a lot of modern discussion, because a lot of what I hear of in the very particular population's strong objection to marriage equality is that it's not legal. You can't use, it's not legal. You don't want, but along the way, we actually separated the two to where the one that is sanctioned by the government is the only one recognized by the government. I've been married twice. I've been married in churches both times. I've had both marriage certificates signed by a priest. Neither one of them can be used as any kind of legal identification. I need the license stamped by the county. So, it's important for me, at least, to understand that there was not only this fear in terms of worshiping Christ or following Jesus that put you in danger from the empire just in general, but also that they were actually the government. and keeping it patriarchal, as we've seen in many governments, keeps things successful.
Yeah, I really appreciate all those points, and I feel like, one thing to kind of add is that, so it is the political system, it's the economic system, it's the kind of moral system, right? It's the government, and it's the same government that kills Jesus and most of Jesus's followers, right? Like, and so how did we get to a place where there's an equal sign between Jesus and Caesar, as opposed to the kind of, diametrically opposed position, and completely, when we talk about kingdom of heaven in Matthew, or kingdom of God in some of the other gospels, like we have, like literally, it's not kingdom, it's basileia. It's literally the word for empire. And the empire in Jesus's time didn't need, it didn't need an introduction. It was, when you said basileia, you meant Rome. But then here you have Jesus talking about this basileia, this empire, tau theo, of God. And reminding people that the emperor is not God, is not the creator, and is not all powerful, even if they have the power to execute Jesus as a revolutionary. So anyways, I just really appreciate how did we get here? Because again, this is where we are now.
That's awesome. I think we have time for one more, and then I want to make sure we give time to our guest speaker. But I see Kristen has a hand up. Oh, I can't hear you, Kristen. Sorry. I can't hear you. I wonder if you want to drop it in the chat.
There we go. Does that work?
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Okay. So somebody had mentioned in here about how that can be used kind of as erasure. There's no men, there's no difference. And that's happened in my church this week. And but in a way that's completely the opposite of what I would have thought. So I finally was able to introduce name tags that had, that were easily changeable and that had like pronouns on them. And because we're trying to be more welcoming.
Yeah.
Now everybody's got kind of he, her, she, her, but that's to show that it's a safe space. I had somebody come at me like she is like saying that I am separating people by gender and I'm being prejudiced and I'm being terrible, and that that this is, she thinks that everybody should then have them on theirs, which made no sense. But I was trying to, she was claiming that she has transgender friends. Well, she and then she called them the transgenders. So I'm thinking she's not that close to them. But in any case, so she's claiming that the only way that she will accept this is if I can get people who will come up to her and say that they would want this. And I have found so much online to back this up, but I'm trying to say to her, we are not the people to speak about this. This is not where our voice should be. And so we're trying to honor what the people who should be speaking and are speaking about this, but she's not listening to that. And she's using that passage kind of exactly as they're saying, to kind of say, no, none of it matters. She's coming from a good place. She's not coming from the place of hate, but she is coming from the place of, I have an idea of how I think it should be, and that's the way that, and I don't need to listen. So it's just interesting how that can be used to erase in more than one way.
Yeah, totally. And I think, well, she's also warmly welcome to join us for this series if you think it would be helpful. Because I think there is so much that we do, as Liz was saying, like we take these pieces out of context in the Bible, we just totally spiritualize them, pull them out of history, pull them out of the living, breathing, struggling people who were living through these situations. And when we do that, like you lose sight of actually these are stories about particular people. Like it's reminding me, my one of my friends showed me this stand-up comedian's clip. And then I promise I'm gonna transition. But his cousin was saying he's a gay comedian. His cousin was saying to him, doesn't it bother you that it says in First Corinthians that like Paul said to them, like you can't be gay? And he said, no, I'm not Corinthian. And why are you reading their mail? Because it is actually like there's a lot going on there that is not actually speaking directly to us. Other people saw it. It's a good clip. I can't remember the comedian's name. But I want to, before I hand it over to our most amazing, fabulous guest speaker, who I'm so excited about, I wanted to, if we could put the slide back up with the text one more time. And I just want us to think about this, this passage, the way we have shown it here. It's a super rich discussion talking about like what it doesn't and does, what it does and doesn't say about marriage, about gender, about the binary, about children, but just thinking about these stories happening back to back. So if you can imagine, actually, like, not Jesus said the thing about eunuchs and then got up and went across town and then he like was talking about children, but like everybody's just sitting on the same street corner together, right? Or something. And Jesus is fighting with people probably about the belonging of gender nonconforming people, right? Like, and saying like, here's what it says, here's my interpretation of it. And immediately after he says this, then there are families who are like, oh, this is the person we're going to bring our kids to. Something about this teaching, something about this spiritual leader saying, there are gender nonconforming people who live this way for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, is like some grandma was like, this is the one that I am going to have bless my child. Why? I wonder. And I wonder if we can put Moses on spotlight. Where is he? I hope he didn't run away.
I'm here. Sorry.
Yay!
I don't know if I was waiting for the spotlight. Sorry.
So I'm super excited. Moses is with us. As I said, Moses is a LGBTQ plus youth organizer, and in the Episcopal world, probably still a youth. You're 25, yes? So you got 10 more years, and then you won't be a young adult anymore in the Episcopal world. And also a chaplain. So Moses, I don't know if you want me to ask you some questions or if you're just ready to go. I'm happy to just let you go.
Yeah, I think I'm ready to go.
Let's go.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Aaron, and thanks Reverend Liz and folks. As Aaron said, my name is Moses. I use the pronouns he or they, and I'm currently based out of Atlanta, Georgia, but I am originally from Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee. And I'm really excited to be on here tonight, and I'm really grateful for the space that's being created. As Aaron said, I am an active member of Freedom Church of the Poor, which is out of the Kairos Center. And I'm Catholic, but I actually do serve in an Episcopal church. So I'm an active member with the Church of the Common Ground here in Atlanta, which is an Episcopal church that is ministry with the unhoused. And I'm also here today because I have worked pretty extensively with trans and non-binary youth for the past couple of years. And I've really learned a lot from that experience and through that work. But before I get into that, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about my own experience as a transgender Catholic person. and talk a little bit about my own experience as a faith leader. And then I can kind of move into some brief lessons of what I've worked and what I've learned from working with youth, and offer up maybe just like a couple of suggestions of what we can all kind of continue to do in our communities, to continue to encourage them to be more affirming and open and loving. But in terms of my own story, so the reason oh, sorry, something just fell. The reason I came to Atlanta a couple years back was I was a student at a seminary here in Atlanta. And I was only there for about a year before I left. But I was not raised in a super religiously observant household, but I did always feel a very strong connection to God, but I never really knew what to do with that. But that connection was kind of strengthened and fortified when I met people like Aaron and Reverend Liz, when I started organizing with the Poor People's Campaign. I was a junior in college when I was selected for a Moral Fusion Student Fellowship, and it really did change the course of my life. And I attended a grassroots training in Washington, D.C., and there were dozens of students from across the country that came together for that training. And it was a really moving experience. It was really beautiful to see all these different kinds of people come together and cross these lines of division and really commit to each other and commit to movement in a really moving way. I was also really moved to hear from faith leaders. So people like Reverend Liz and Reverend Barber, and then also other organizers who demonstrated this commitment to this principle of everybody in and nobody out. I had never met faith leaders like that. I had never met religious people like that. I had never really experienced that before in my life. But it felt like people were really taking it seriously and emphasizing that we needed each other to do this work. And no matter who you were and no matter who you came from, you had to be in that space and that you belonged in that space. And I think it was that total like safety and empowerment that made me feel like I could totally express who I was and what I wanted to be. And because that experience was so informed by so many faith leaders, it's actually what inspired me to go to seminary about a year and a half later, which was very confusing for a lot of people in my life. They were all like, what? But it really was very transformative to me. But when I did go to seminary, I really struggled there. And I don't believe it was specific to the seminary that I attended. There were lots of great people there and a lot of great teachers there. But it was actually just really difficult for me to be in a very Christian environment. It was hard for me to find my place within the community. It was hard for me to find my place in the school and in churches. I loved going to church. I loved Mass. I was at Mass upwards of like 2 to 3 times a week at certain parts of my life. But I never actually really felt like I was totally welcome in those communities. I never really felt like folks were opening doors and inviting me to be in, even though I was really showing up and making an effort to try and be involved. And I really struggled because it was the sense of community and affirmation that I found in places like the Poor People's Campaign. I didn't really see that reflected in the communities that I was going to. And so when I left seminary, I struggled for a long time because I felt very confused. I felt very confused because I had felt such a strong calling, but then I felt like I had just been wrong. And all at this time too, I was still working at Church of the Common Ground, but didn't really see myself in a pastoral role there for a very long time, but more just as kind of an administrator, but I just kind of kept showing up. But I feel like as a trans faith leader, the places where I actually was developed the most were at Church of the Common Ground and also with the Freedom Church of the Poor. And I think the thing that both of these spaces have in common is that both of these spaces had a real commitment to me and also to other folks for who they were and how they showed up. I feel that these spaces are always emphasizing that whoever you are and however you show up, you're welcome there. And also that our differences and us coming together are what will make us stronger. And that commitment to kind of overcome these things, to join each other, is what makes us what will make us stronger. And I also think what's important too is that in both of these spaces, folks are welcome at any point in their journey. Folks are welcome at the points of their journey where they feel a very strong connection to God and want to sing God's praises all the time, and also the parts of their lives where they don't really want anything to do with God, and they don't believe in God, and they don't believe in religion, and all this stuff. But all of these folks are welcome at any of those points. And also the other significant part is that folks are encouraged to take on leadership, and folks are encouraged to push themselves as leaders. And so they're offered spaces to preach and to reflect. They're offered spaces to lead Bible study, and they're offered that and encourage folks to take on that challenge for themselves, even if they think that, they don't know the Bible enough, or they're not, good enough, or they're not smart enough. They're still encouraged with a loving community to try these things and really, really push themselves. And so I feel that those things are really kind of what pushed me to be able to more comfortably step into these positions of faith leadership, and also in my own life, move out of my work, which was a very secular space, into a more religious space to work with trans and LGBT folks. And so I want to take some time to talk about my work, specifically with trans and non-binary folks, and talk about how that has impacted how I understand to empower trans and non-binary youth and communities, and also including in the context of our church. So as I said, I worked at the Sam and Devora Foundation for Transgender Youth for about 3 years. I left very recently, but in my time there, I worked really closely with youth and young adults across the country to help them connect with each other, to thrive, and to be empowered. And through our organization, I helped develop the Trans Mentor Project, which is a national virtual mentoring program that pairs trans and non-binary youth with an adult trans or non-binary mentor. And the program offers one-on-one mentoring. It also offers community chat rooms, events, special events, stuff like that. And outside of that, I also helped coordinate 2 trans youth retreats, which were 3-day retreats where trans and non-binary youth got to go to a camp led by trans and non-binary counselors, and then also helped curate a series of storytelling events for trans and non-binary youth and young adults to help to develop and share their own stories. And so I mostly worked with high schoolers, like about age, a little bit in the middle school, so like 12-year-olds to like 18-year-olds, and then also folks that were closer to my age, and then also worked some with mentors who were older than me. But I learned a lot working with trans youth, and I also learned a lot from people's reactions or reflections when I told them that I would work with trans youth. And I would say, like, a big thing that I heard a lot, was when I would tell people, I would often have kind of, well-meaning adults who were, very progressive in all the ways, tell me that they heard a lot about kids undergoing dangerous gender affirming treatment and surgery that was irreversible. And so they would, tell me stuff like, they support trans youth, but they're really weary about these medical practices that they hear of and stuff. And I know from my work that the reality is that gender affirming surgery for youth is actually quite rare. Like medical interventions is quite rare. And when it does come, it comes after extensive consultation and discussion with therapists, doctors, youth, and their parents. Oftentimes youth who gain access to these surgeries, which there's a whole thing, you might not be able to afford it, you might not be able to access it in your state, you might go through the process and decide you don't want to do it. But oftentimes the youth are either one of the only or the only person in their community to have these kinds of medical interventions. And then often when they do get it, if they're young, it's because it's life-saving. It's because they need it. So much so that I have worked with youth where they may live in a state where gender affirming care has been banned in their state. And so they have to drive 7 hours to a nearby state to get the medical care that they need because it is that much of a medical concern for them. But I think these assumptions that, people come to me with are not necessarily because folks are ill-intentioned or because they're anti-LGBTQ. I think often more what it's a reflection of is because they are kind of misinformed by just like the constant, assault of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and lies that we hear on a constant basis. It's this constant kind of barrage of attacks that skews how we view these communities on every level, not just on like the most like radical, far right, awful level, but also just in like our everyday kind of perception of these things as well, especially if we don't have strong connections to these communities. And I think that brings me to another important thing that I learned working with youth, which is that, I think we can probably all safely say that queerness and transness has become a lot more visible within the last few years. I think now more than ever, we see more movies, more TV shows, more public figures that are more proudly, queer or trans or non-binary and stuff like that. And in some ways, I hear often that it seems like the best time ever to be a trans or non-binary kid, because it feels like we're at a time where the heightened visibility has made it more acceptable or safe to be out and proud. And while I understand where that's coming from, I do think it is impactful that kids, may see themselves reflected on screens and stuff like that. What I found is that listening to stories of trans and non-binary youth is that although queerness has certainly become more visible, the lived reality and conditions that trans and non-binary youth live in every day has not actually really changed. So kids are still facing bullying and harassment at their schools, at their churches, in their homes, and now from the government. And actual material access to things like gender affirming care, safe and affordable housing, or guaranteed safe education, none of that has actually changed. And so one thing that I hear a lot from older queer folks that work with us is that they assume that being trans or non-binary today must be so much better and easier or safer than when they were young. But in developing these relationships with youth, they come to find that that's not necessarily true. And a lot of the actually same stuff that they faced when they were kids is the same thing that kids are facing today. But these intergenerational relationships are really the crux and the most critical part of our work. So these relationships between older folks and younger folks as well. And I think that kind of brings me to my last point of the biggest thing I learned is that, and this is something my coworker and I would talk about all the time, which is when we started working at this organization and working at this job, we assumed that, all the youth who would take part in our programming or join Trans Mentor Project would want to be talking all about, questions they had about HRT, questions they had about transness, questions they had about all this stuff. And while that was definitely a part of it, what we found that people wanted more was just friends, and what people wanted more was just community. They wanted to see queer and trans adults that were happy and that were thriving and that had a career. And then after they saw that and knew that that was possible, they were fine just to hang out and, talk about video games or, whatever they were passionate about. They were all obsessed with this cartoon called the Moo Moons. I don't know, Moomins or something. I don't know. It was a little before my time, but they loved that. But so in a way, the main thing that I learned was that, these kids are, so special and they're so wonderful and so beautiful. But in a lot of ways, they're also just like every other kid. They all struggle with the same things that other kids do. They have the same fears and worries and anxieties that other kids do. But they also just have to face some other things that other kids don't have to, that aren't trans, but it's just like other kids. They all deserve spaces and times where they can be just kids and they can be happy and they can be free and they can be loved for who they are. The organization that I was in was very intentionally a secular space. A big reason from that was because so many of the youth that came to us had experienced religious trauma. And so it was very intentional that it was a completely secular space that was asked for by our youth. But I still do think there is, a couple things that I think are valuable to carry over, not just in a secular space, but also in a sacred space. And I think the first is that people really notice when you make an effort to see them for who they are and have them included. And I think that when you are queer or trans and you walk into a church, I think kind of you come with like, maybe this is just me projecting, but like, feel like you kind of come with an automatic chip on your shoulder. You know, you just like don't know, you're always trying to suss it out. And so I think it's really important to show folks that you respect them and love them for who they are. And so I heard someone here today talk about how they put pronouns on their name tags, and that goes a long way. You know, I feel like one of the biggest things I'd hear from kids is like struggling a lot that people weren't using their correct pronouns or their correct name, and that being something that really affected them. And so it's really important to like make an effort to do that, because they notice and they remember if you don't do it, and they remember if you do it. And I always suggest to, like, if you have trouble doing it, because I know it can be hard when people that you might have known a long time might have changed their name or might have changed their pronouns, you can practice. I have to do it often sometimes too. Like, I will literally write out stuff about people with their pronouns, with their names. I will practice saying it out loud. And if I do mess up, because I also mess up, if I mess up when I'm talking to someone, I just correct myself and, you know, move on. You know, the worst thing you can do is like apologize, but make it like a big thing, or then just be like, oh, it's just so hard, like blah, blah, blah. It's okay if it's hard, but you just don't have to tell the person it's hard. You can tell other people that, but you don't have to tell the person, you know? But it's also important, you know, like that we're also gently correcting those around us too, especially when that person isn't there, you know, like gently reminding people with love of the correct name and pronouns, because that also creates a culture where people know then that it's not acceptable to be, you know, it's not acceptable to be, you know, using the wrong things or not trying and stuff like that. So I think that's important to do. And then the other thing I'll say is that, you know, this is more of a fun one, but I think it's really valuable and important to try and immerse yourself or in some way in queer and trans culture as you can. I think it's really important to kind of like open yourself up to that in both like sacred and secular ways. And so some of that might mean like that you are just like, when you open up kind of faith leadership to folks who are queer or trans, you might hear or think about stuff in a way that you never had before. It might make you feel uncomfortable. You might not agree with it. But the important thing to do is that you're listening to it and that you kind of are open to hearing it. And then I also encourage, like, you know, there's a TV show that I really recommend that's called We're Here. And it's a TV show that's on HBO Max, and it's about 3 drag queens who go to small cities across the United States, and they put on drag shows in those towns. And it's a really powerful show. And I watch it a lot with folks who, especially folks in my life who kind of struggle with like LGBTQ stuff. It's a really good show for folks to just kind of see kind of something about like what drag is all about, what it means for people, and to also see examples like the folks that do drag on the show are not just trans or queer people, but also cis people who are really uncomfortable with it, who are allies, who it's new to. But it's a really beautiful testament for what beauty can happen when we kind of open ourselves up to things that we don't understand or don't quite, you know, get right away, but what can kind of happen when we open up, you know, that and stuff. So yeah, and I think it's just worth opening up for folks to other pieces of culture and stuff that is important and sacred to them too. And yeah, so I think that's kind of mainly what I had tonight. I forgot to time myself, so I don't know if that was 15 minutes, but I'm very grateful for the space, and really grateful for Aaron and Reverend Liz and everyone on here. So thank you.
Everybody's clapping, but they're on mute, and I'm definitely clapping out loud. Thank you so much, Moses. This is really cool. There's great links, including the link to We're Here in the chat. So please keep following the chat. We'll send stuff in the follow-up materials. But I think folks would probably love to ask you some questions, Moses. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. Okay, I see Kristen's got a hand up, and folks can also drop questions in the chat. Kristen, are you able to come off mute?
Is that
Yeah,
a different Kristen? Because then mine
that's
might.
you. We can hear you.
Oh, sorry, mine shouldn't be up. I need to take it down again then.
Oh, okay. No problem. Okay. Questions for Moses. And I just want to thank you again, Moses, because I think it's especially in a climate like the one we're in, it can just be very hard for people to be like, we're talking about regular ass kids, who would just want to do the basic things in many ways that regular ass kids want to do. So thank you. Oh, Beth had a question here. What resources might you recommend for well-intentioned but clueless older congregations?
That is a good question. And I'd be curious too, Erin, to hear your thoughts as well. But I think yeah, I mean, I think off like the top of my mind, I mean, I think, Erin, I'm going to pass it to you first. Let me think on it in a second. You might have stuff more at the top of your mind than I do.
I mean, I think you shared some really good stuff already. It sounds like We're Here is like just like as a visual kind of thing and a low bar, like this is just gonna be a fun cultural thing to do together that is not involving living, breathing. It involves living, breathing people, but they're on video, so like you don't have that direct pressure. I also think, figuring out um like what makes the congregation kind of tick, right? What are people like? What is their identity like? Are they like, listen, the thing that we do at this church is blah, and like maybe they have like a really big back to school backpack drive, and that's their thing. Like they're so super into it. Like I feel like you could, or they have like an annual, I don't know, like bake sale thing that's really important to them. But I feel like you can kind of take any of those things, right? And introduce this idea of like, oh, right, like this is so important. We want this to be as welcoming as to as many people as possible. How can we really make that true? What would it take for the backpack drive to like be like, maybe it's not like we need 50 pink backpacks and 50 blue backpacks and everybody is going to be happy with that, and we're going to go by the name written on the paper. And so if your name is Becky on the paper, you're going to get a pink backpack. Like just thinking through a lot of, I feel like ministry is always thinking through a lot of little details like that to make sure like you're not up here in your idea of what's happening and you're actually your bottom line is like, am I treating this person with dignity and respect? I think theology is also really important. I think doing Bible study is really important, because it may not be, maybe especially for Episcopalians, it may not be like our first source of resistance on this stuff, but it's in there, even for us. Like there's so much weight um around gender that it's just embedded in all of the language we use at church, all of the physical structures of our churches, the bathrooms, stuff like that. And so I think if you can come to people and be like, okay, we are in this building for Jesus, and we go outside of this building for Jesus, and wait a minute, what did he say? Like, let's read that again. So I think theology is really important, but it's also about, yeah, figuring out what opportunities actually exist for this congregation to be engaging in a different way. I don't know if that's how you would answer that, Moses.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Erin. That's helpful, and also just want to uplift some of the documentaries that Robert put in the chat too. So, Will and Harper, which is a new one on Netflix, and then also Disclosure, which is a really good documentary. And then also there's some like fun like children's stuff too, like in terms of movies and stuff. So there's one like called Nimona, and just I can think of some other like off the top of my head too, that is like movies that have like queer and trans characters that are more geared towards like kids and stuff like that, that I think have been like really valuable for folks to see too. I think there is something about like folks seeing it in that kind of way and that delivered to them that is really powerful. But I do really think like movies and TV shows and music are often really powerful ways for people to really like connect and open up to these things, because I think that like it moves you in your heart in a way that I think other stuff kind of maybe doesn't, or that comes afterwards. And then also I would suggest too, if it's more stuff that is like kind of like a little bit more like straighter, there's in terms of like straight media, or like straight kind of more simple stuff, there's an organization called Gender Cool, which puts out some videos of LGBTQ youth kind of talking about their experience and stuff, and a little bit of like an empowering and really inspiring way. And then I also think that Glisten is in sometimes a really powerful resource for some of the media that they put out, and some of the kind of voices that they uplift of folks in the community as well.
Awesome. I think we have two questions. I see there's one in the chat from Merrick, and then Christy's got a hand. So Merrick's asking, how do you support vulnerable queer and trans youth during the holiday seasons? Any special activities or gatherings?
That's a really good question, because holidays is just hard for like, I think honestly, if you have a hard like family situation or any kind of stuff, holidays are really difficult. And especially for like trans or non-binary, youth, or, folks and stuff like that, they may be having to go back to situations where, they're just not very much seen in the way that they want to. And so I think finding ways to kind of have like special support, if you have the resources, one of the things that is like powerful to do is to have like kind of, as someone put in the chat, like a Friendsgiving, so like a queer or trans holiday party basically. So at my job we've done I think we called it like Festival of the Fairy Frogs or something. We're a secular organization, so we kind of, it was like Festival of the Fairy Frogs, and it was just a sweet thing we did where basically, folks had kind of secret Santa basically, and it was, you didn't buy anything, but it was just about like writing poems for each other, making a picture for each other and stuff like that, and then being able to kind of celebrate and have that community in that way. So offering kind of like a space, an event where people can still feel like they can like be themselves and have kind of that have kind of that inclusivity, I think is important. And also, you might have youth though that might not be in a space where they could go to something publicly, and so or like go to something that is specifically queer or trans. And so I think also what that means is, just if you're having like a youth group event for something, or a youth group something, making it a point to have that be inclusive, and making that a point to make sure that people's identities and who they are being honored there. And so kids can go there and be there, regardless and stuff. So, yeah.
Awesome. I would add, if you're like a relative or a person who's still in that young person's life, you don't have to be like cool. You don't have to like spend a but I had my aunt, who is the aunt who got everybody like a purple cat sweater for Christmas. Like, she was the person in my family who was like, as soon as she found out I had a new name, we didn't even have a conversation about it, but she's like, started sending me like all the magnets with my new name on it in the mail. Because like when you first come out, you don't have any of those, like those little random tchotchkes and keychains that have and like that was all very important to me actually. So that's magnets with people's names on them is a cheap Secret Santa gift. I see Christy has a hand up.
I was wanting to kind of go back to, we were talking about older adults and how to help them. And that's really my focus right now, because as a cisgender hetero person, who's kind of had a paradigm shift in the last 3 or 4 years because of my own personal experiences with my family. What I have wanted to do was like bring that information that I have made myself learn quickly to people who, because they're socialized to not know a damn thing about it, you know, but do care, like they genuinely care about being loving, kind, and accepting humans. But if you don't know, you just don't know. And so I guess I wanted to ask, like, we can't sort of force people to like just jump in to the media stuff. The kids for sure are ready, but the older adults, I feel like, especially Episcopalians, like they need to be, like, they're very smart and they like to be educated and they like to have lessons and be presented with information that they can digest and ask questions about. So I guess I just wanted to ask your thoughts about that.
Moses, I want you to answer this one too, but I'm gonna plug that on October 28th in this class, we will be joined by Dr. Natalie Zilagi from the Yale Child Study Center, whose entire body of work these last few years has actually just been that on like a research, policy, clinical, and they've been like writing a whole bunch of legal briefs too around the importance of gender affirming care. And I had a she's Episcopalian, that's why we got her. And she said, like her and several actually clergy have brought up to me, like, we have people who are really only comfortable for whatever reason, like their lane is like, I'm going to come at this as an intellectual issue. I can't really get emotional about it. I can't. So I need you to give me data and I need you to give me research and I need you to give me facts. And you would be actually quite disturbed about how, we've talked about, there's a lot of talk about misinformation and disinformation being out there. And it's not just like the like super obviously wackadoodle stuff that you see on social media. It's also like filtering in at very like professional levels of society, right? So like people in congregations who are like anesthesiologists who are like falling for significant amounts of disinformation coming from poorly framed research around gender affirming care. So I will plug October 28th for those people. And Moses, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, one thing I'll just put is I always suggest too the US Trans Survey as like a actually like pretty good barometer in terms of, or just like something that is like by and for like trans people in a way, and also offers like some really helpful information about like just like, because basically what it was is just an outpush of them basically surveying trans folks across the country and asking about like, what's your housing situation? Have you faced discrimination? Have you, done all this? And they just released the 2022 findings like a little bit earlier this year. And it's a very helpful resource in that way in terms of research. And then it also will uplift again GLSEN as a really good tool in terms of seeing some of that research. GLSEN has like an educational arm, a research arm, and a media arm. And some of the research that they've done has been very powerful and also shows a lot of kind of the conditions and stuff in terms of like in schools and kind of stuff like that. So I would uplift those two as good kind of resources for some of the research aspects.
Awesome. I think we're going to go a little bit over tonight. I'm just going to tell people. I see Alicia. Give Alicia the last question here.
Hi, everyone. So I think Christy made a really good comment. She said that in trying to teach older adults, they want to be kind and loving people. And I have this very unusual kind of life journey where I was born a boomer, raised as a Gen Xer, but actually educated as a millennial. So everything I learned about gender academically, I learned within the last 15 years. And like Christy, I had a paradigm shift. But what's interesting is that in my church, in my personal church, my children, who are now 32 and 35, grew up in my church. My older son identifies as a homosexual man. My younger one identifies as a homosexual, biological, non-binary person who uses they, them pronouns. My younger one was the most gorgeous maid of honor I've ever had or I've ever seen. And my point is that my children come to church with me on Easter when I can drag them in. They come to church with me on Christmas when I can drag them in. And everybody that has known them their whole life just wraps them up in their arms. So happy to see them. How are you doing? My older son is an actor. He's doing a play that opens on Friday. 20 people from the church are going. So what I did, because I actually did a presentation, like a Gender 101 presentation for my church, and I used a lot of GLSEN resources. And what I said to them is, you're already doing this. You're already being inclusive right here. You do this every week or every holiday. What you need to extend that to is to recognize that if somebody that you don't know walks in that looks like this person you've known their whole life, you want to reach out and be just. And once they realize they've been doing it anyway, they're a little bit more open to hearing more about it. That's all. Thank you.
That's called good organizing. Good job. Make them think, wait, we already are the leaders that we've been waiting for. Well, okay. First, we have to give another huge round of applause to our fabulous guest, my son in the spirit, Moses Hernandez. Thank you, Moses. And then to close us out, we're going to do the shortest second round through this same Bible passage. So Reverend Melanie, thank you. If we could get the slide back up. I'd just like us to read it through in English and Spanish again. And then if folks could just either maybe drop in the chat or raise your hand and just say one word or phrase that you're leaving here with tonight. I think that can double as our closing prayer. So could we get volunteers in English and Spanish? I see Lissa. Awesome. I think Lissa got it first. And then let's go ahead, Lissa.
Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." Then people brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." When he had placed his hands on them, he went on from there.
Thank you so much, Lissa. Let's have Antonice read our Spanish.
Jesús les dijo, no todos pueden cumplir con este precepto, sino solo aquellos a quienes les ha sido dado. Porque hay eunucos que sí nacieron desde el vientre de su madre, y hay eunucos que han sido hechos eunucos por los hombres. También hay eunucos que asimismo se hicieron eunucos por causa del reino de los cielos. El que pueda aceptar, que lo acepte. Entonces le trajeron a algunos niños para que les pusieran las manos sobre ellos y orara. Y los discípulos los reprendieron. Pero Jesús dijo, dejad a los niños, no les impidáis que vengan a mí, porque de los que son como estos es el reino de los cielos. Y después de poner las manos sobre ellos, se fue de allí.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Antonice. I'm seeing in the chat what people are leaving with is acceptance. Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. The final commandment, love one another, should accept it. Do not hinder them. Do not hinder them. Acceptance. The one who can accept this should accept it. Those who choose. The kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Accept. Accept. It's beautiful. Amen, everybody. And love. Yes. Thank you all so much. Quick reminder, we will have no class next week in observance of Indigenous Peoples Day. And then on October 14th, we will be back here. Our guest speakers will be Reverend Shaniqua Brokenleg, our racial justice staff officer, and Chris Chavers from the National Transgender Law Center. They're going to be talking about the intersection between colonialism and gender injustice. So please join us back here October 14th. And until then, blessings, protection, and joy on everybody. Have a great night.